Never thought I'd open a Shabbat Shuva drasha with those words, but here you are. It's the Shuvat Tfilot Tzedakah, Ma'avirin es Roya HaGezerah. It's a Shuva we understand. Repentance, a change of direction, certainly is Ma'avirin es Roya HaGezerah, we believe can change the fate of us as individuals, as communities, as humanity. Tefillah, prayer for forgiveness, for help. We also understand Ma'avirin es Roya HaGezerah. But tzedakah is a little bit of an interesting one. I mean, no doubt tzedakah is a good thing, very important and exceptional mitzvah. But in what way is it Ma'avirin es Roya HaGezerah? Is it just a third thing? Happens to be, if we do this mitzvah, then it's Ma'avirin es Roya HaGezerah. It helps improve our fate. But does it somehow integrate with the other two? In the same way as Teshuvah and Tefillah are intertwined, they have a commonality. Teshuvah, repentance, reflection; Tefillah, prayer, reflection. These are common denominators. They work together. Is tzedakah also a third element which somehow connects with the other two? Or is it just its own thing? Now, the source of this idea that Teshuvah, Tefillah, tzedakah, Ma'avirin es Roya HaGezerah is based upon a Yerushalmi in Tanis, which quotes a remarkable pasuk. Pasuk is talking, a pasuk in Kol Nidre Appeal, which Hashem is talking about his relationship to Klal Yisrael. He says, "Vayukonu ami asher nikra shmi aleim." If my people, upon whom my name is called, shall humble themselves. And then it identifies three features that they can do, which vani eshma min hashemaim ve'eslach chatzosam, which will lead to me hearing from on high and forgiving their sin. And what are these three features? Vayispalalu, they will daven, tefillah. Vayivakshu panai, v'yashuvu, they will seek my face, and they will return v'yashuvu. So v'yispalalu is tefillah, v'yashuvu is teshuvah, vayivakshu panai, they will seek my face, they will seek my presence. Says the Talmud Yerushalmi, this is tzedakah. Interesting stance or take on what tzedakah is. Tzedakah is somehow bikush panai, somehow seeking my face, seeking my presence. And the Rambam understands this pasuk to be telling us that tzedakah is not a third incidental feature, not an aside, it's not something completely separate from the other two, but somehow this is of the essence of what Yom Kippur and Teshuvah and Tefillah are about. It's connected with them. And this means to say that if we understand Teshuvah to be a fundamental reassessing of what we are, then tzedakah is central to this process. First of all, tzedakah, charity, means that we recognize our need for others. We recognize that we can't live in splendid isolation, doing it alone. We acknowledge our weakness and our interdependence, that we need others, our vulnerability, that the world we live in is a world that only works through tzedakah. In fact, we live in a world which is Olam Chesed Yibana. We live in a world in which the whole existence that we experience is a gift of chesed, a gift from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Tzedakah rebuilds our relationship with Hashem. It's called tzedek, justice. We don't call it charity in Hebrew, it's called justice, because I recognize that I don't deserve to have everything which I've been gifted with. Others also have a call on it. Others also have a tzedek on it. When I'm sharing and giving, I'm not giving away something which is truly mine, but I'm giving something which actually belongs to others. Tzedakah demands of us really to make the most fundamental assessment in life. The most fundamental assessment in life. Is it about myself? Is it about my own needs, my own wants, my own ego, my own hubris? Or am I willing to sacrifice something in order to achieve an end goal, something beyond that? And it's in that sense that Teshuvah, Tefillah, tzedakah are truly intertwined. Tzedakah isn't just a mitzvah, it's part of this package of reassessing where our priorities lie. Do our priorities lie in our own material pleasure and our own needs and our own wants? Or do they lie in recognizing a higher tzedek, a higher justice, a higher right, the essence of the world, which is an act of giving and gift from HaKadosh Baruch Hu? And this leads me really to the first thing I wanted to talk about this evening. I'm not going to be making this year, I was able to make a classic Kol Nidre Appeal on the first night of Yom Kippur, on the night of Yom Kippur, tomorrow evening. I will, Mitzvah Hashem, be visiting the various minyanim over the course of Kol Nidre and the rest of the day. But I'll certainly only be able to speak on Yom Kippur evening to a relatively small group of people because of the way we are distributing the minyanim this year. And therefore I wanted to use this opportunity to speak a little bit about tzedakah and really to make an appeal to everyone. This year we are appealing for two causes which are also intertwined with each other, though separate. We're appealing for our shul, for our kehillah, for Ner Yisrael, and for the wonderful gemach, which we have the privilege also of hosting here within our community. Our shul, we know that Nea Yisrael is passionate about its role of serving the Kehillah, of being there to support our own community, being there to support the members of the community. The last months, the last year, has called upon the community to invest efforts, really unprecedented perhaps, in its existence. The Kehillah is privileged to have lay leaders, to have Gaboim, to have members of the board, trustees, Askonim, people who engage in chesed. A remarkable number spread across the community have dedicated immeasurable and immeasurable hours in order to make the Kehillah, the community, continue to function. I'm talking here about individual acts of chesed and looking after people within our community, looking after people through the ill health challenges, through the financial challenges of the last few months. And I'm talking about simply allowing this place to run, to allow this shiur to take place, to allow this tefillah to take place in this Kehillah. And none of this can be taken for granted. It involves an enormous effort and an enormous amount of work, and also involves cost. It's costs for the community to run. And therefore, this is really the first part of the appeal that we are making. If we want this Kehillah to be able to continue really to be a beacon of creative programming, of tefillah, of Torah, of chesed, of shiurim, of activity, of chance for us to mix in whichever manner is possible, we need your help with this. So please, this is the first appeal that we're making. In addition, as mentioned, separate to the Kehillah, run independently under the guidance of its own trustees, but working very closely with the community is an exceptional tzedakah, and this is the Nea Yisrael Gemach. This is a tzedakah that is run in the most transparent way possible. It's run with exceptional dedication, really helping both within our own community itself and across northwest London. And again, this is only able to do its work because of the help of all of you, because of the help of the people that support it. The times are difficult. The calls on the Gemach are really unprecedented, and probably again in the last decades, this is the most unprecedented financial time of challenge for all of us. And again, it's only possible for the Gemach to continue operating, continue doing what it's doing, if everyone helps towards it. And therefore, there are links. I think there's been a link posted on the chat of the Zoom for those who are watching over Zoom, and there will be an email that goes out as soon as this drasha is finished, with the various methods to pay, whether one's paying through Achisomach, through text messaging, through linking to our website. But please, I just really want to ask everyone, both here and who are watching both near and far via Zoom, to please help us both in preserving the Kehillah and allowing the Kehillah to do what it does, and also to help us continue as a community to do chesed through the vehicle of the Gemach that is run. So that's the Kol Nidre Appeal. I now want to really talk about the core topic and title of this evening's shiur. I said, Shuvah Tefillah Tzedakah, Shiur Nidrai Appeal, Tzedakah in particular, Tatzil Mimoves. And there's no doubt, communally over the last few months, we've been thinking about life and death issues like no time before, no time previously. In fact, originally this was going to be my topic for my Shabbos HaGadol drasha, and then I didn't give it because we were going through times of really life and death struggles for many, both within the community and beyond. And I didn't feel this was an appropriate topic at the time, but it's definitely one that needs revisiting. It certainly has a halacha l'maisa element. As a nation, the UK is thinking about its relationship to organ donation. The law has changed recently, as we are aware, towards an opt-out system. In other words, no longer is it assuming that people who sign on to the organ donor registry through the act of signing on are indicating that they are happy and willing for their organs to be used to save lives of recipients, donees who need to receive these organs in order to be able to live. But instead, we're switching to a system of opting out. In other words, the presumption is that everyone is under law able for their organs to be taken, to be used for organ donation, unless one explicitly expresses one's wishes otherwise through opting out of the system. And clearly, this is an important topic for us to address communally, and has been addressed over the last few months in particular, and I will reference some of that. Now, before talking more about this, I want to say several points of introduction. The first point is this is surely the most difficult subject and sensitive topic to speak about imaginable. First of all, it's sensitive because we're talking about literally issues of life and death on both sides of the equation. Pikuach Nefesh, we know, really comes at the peak of the pyramid of halachic values and halachic priorities. This week, the last week, tomorrow, I'm dealing with Shilas, as are all Rabbanim, involving Yom Kippur. And we know as important as Yom Kippur is, fasting Yom Kippur is, life and health comes ahead of that. So, Pikuach Nefesh, saving a life, what could be a greater halachic value, what could be a greater moral and human value than that? And yet, exactly which way the Pekuach Nefesh here swings is not at all clear-cut, as we will hear. On the one hand, the saving lives through organ donation being possible, what can be a greater and more wonderful thing, the developments of science and technology and healthcare over the last few decades that make this possible is something wonderful, something fantastic. On the other hand, there's serious concerns in the other direction also, particularly, as we will see later, around the definition of death in halacha, the definition of death, and whether organ donation may sometimes involve causing the early demise of someone who otherwise was halachically still considered an alive person. And therefore one really has the most serious and chomer shilas on both sides of the equation. So certainly the most halachically sensitive and important topic one can speak about. And it's also sensitive because people within our own community, friends, acquaintances, people here in this kehillah have benefited from organ donation. We have people who walk into our shul every single Shabbos, who are only there because of this development in science and in healthcare. And for us as a community to not always be so open to this, to recognize the halachic challenges around this area, can sometimes make for difficult and uncomfortable discussion. We can perhaps find ourselves in scenarios in which there are forms of organ donation which are not halachically acceptable, and yet we are recipients of these, and there becomes a conflict of values which is very, very sensitive. We can appear sometimes almost selfish, in which we are perhaps recipients and receiving from this area of development of medicine, medical care, from organ donation, and yet choosing to opt out as a community. And this is again a most difficult dilemma and conundrum to find oneself caught up in. So this is the first difficulty of speaking around this topic. The second difficulty is it's extremely complex. It's just tough. It's just a very, very hard topic. Halachically, very, very difficult. One's trying to take difficult halachic ideas and apply them to modernity, apply them to new situations, which is always challenging, to new technology, changing the whole time. And it's also medically and scientifically difficult. I spent hours really trying to speak to those professionals who are in the field and read the literature and consult experts. Some of the stuff is tough for a layman to understand. And therefore one finds oneself caught up in this trap in which very often the people who are at the cutting edge of halacha do not understand that which is at the cutting edge of the science and the medicine. And similarly, those who are at the cutting edge in terms of the research and the medical innovations do not understand the halachic stance. And to put the two halves of the conversation together and understand both halves is really is very, very difficult. Part of the complexity and part of the difficulty is also around terminology. And this is something that I will revisit. But whilst a lot of the language used is somehow presented as if it's an international conversation, that simply isn't the case. And the moment now, every community, every country, every legal body has its own definitions of many of the terms. And this also poses challenges. Pretty much Googling the topic or relying on some of the leaflets and pamphlets that go around, signed by international figures, is almost meaningless in this conversation because each region and each country, and sometimes even within one country, there are different laws and regulations around this. And therefore the same terminology being used in different areas simply means different things. The popular language used isn't always exactly the correct scientific terminology, and there's just simply different terms that are being used. So this is another additional complexity. My share tonight will certainly focus here on the UK because I do want to offer practical guidance to the Kehillah. Some of it can be extrapolated abroad, some of it can't. And I'm aware that within our own Kehillah, people are watching from Eretz Yisrael. Many of us will perhaps end up in Eretz Yisrael and wish to be there. And one should be aware that each area has its own medical and legal and therefore halachic framework also. And it's not at all simple to translate across countries in terms of this conversation. The final point of introduction I want to really make is first just to ask everyone to please listen to the end. Those who are watching via Zoom and so on, please listen to the end because this needs to be heard holistically. And we're going to need to explore avenues and possibilities which may not end up halacha l'maisa or maybe a little uncomfortable. Therefore, it's important to have the chance to contextualize everything. But I do just want to conclude by thanking some of the experts who helped me. Not all of them want their names to be shared, but certainly in the rabbinic community, Diane Ehrentroy, Diane Geddy of the London Based In, who has really been a leading figure in finding a solution here in the UK for this and has shared with the Rabbonim very generously his expertise. In Eretz Yisrael, an old classmate of mine and a Talmud Chacham par excellence in this area, Rabbi Yehuda Finchus, and Professor Avram Steinberg, who we've had visiting us here in this community, has shared his expertise both through his books, through his articles orally, and through his visits here. And in terms of medical experts, I had the great privilege of hours of conversation with Professor Anthony Warrens, who's pretty much as senior as one can get in the UK on organ donation, and many of the doctors in our own community, including Dr. Edgar Bodkin, who works in these fields and has helped again me understand this topic. So I really just want to thank them for hours of their time, and any of the credit due to my understanding is really thanks to them, and any errors and misunderstandings are solely mine. So this is the topic of opt-in or opt-out with organ donation, and many parts of this halachic discussion are probably somewhat familiar to many of us who are gathered here. We've heard Shiurim before on these topics and perhaps read up a little bit about them, and really I wanted to use the time available for a swift tour of some of the main halachic issues, and argue that even without reaching psak in every single scenario, we need to understand that probably each case needs to be looked at on a case-by-case basis. So many areas I will simply share where the halachic and medical discussion is up to, and I think much of the halachic conclusion really leads us down the realization that each aspect needs to be looked at by itself. I want to try and just do a fairly whirlwind tour of the main halachic points of discussion in order to help us understand what's going on in this conversation. Now, before we come on to the very thorny issue of how we define death and therefore the essence of many of the halachic problems around, or potential problems around organ donation, there are several other halachic factors that need to be considered, which we should spend some time talking about. And in particular, many of these are based around a pasuk which are printed in source 1 at the top of page 1, which is the basic pasuk around how we treat corpses, how we treat cadavers, how we treat dead people, dead bodies. Interestingly, in the context of a criminal, so we're talking about a criminal of the most terrible kind, a criminal who is deserving of capital punishment. And such an individual, when they're condemned to death, you wish to hang him on a tree, do not leave his carcass overnight. He should surely be buried. It is a curse of God to have such a person hanged, etc., etc. So Rashi's understanding of this pasuk is that it is telling us that every human being, even this person who has been chayv mita, has been deserving of capital punishment, someone who has sinned in the most terrible way possible, it's a chil of Hashem, it's a devastation of God's name for a human being who is b'tselem Elokim, who is an image of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to be treated in such a terrible manner. And we basically learn out of this pasuk three halachic principles intertwined, linked with each other. The first one is that of nivel hameis, not abusing a dead body. Lo solim, don't leave it hanging overnight. That a mace, a dead body, needs to be treated with kavod, with respect. Nivel, it shouldn't be damaged or needlessly disrespected in how it's treated. The second halachic concept, kavod tikrenu, is a chiyuv kavura, an obligation of burial. What degree this obligation is it only on the family and on anyone else? Is it on a whole body, or part of a body, or body parts, every kazayas, every part of the body? These are big areas of machlokus and halacha, exactly what the chiyuv is. And the third element is an issa hana. One isn't allowed to benefit from a dead body for no good reason. Now, looking at each of these issues by themselves, there's a lot of halachic discussion around them, around this issue of kavod hameis and chiyuv kavura, and when this can be, when a chiyuv kavura can be suspended, or when a nivel hameis, one can even look at conducting an autopsy, for example, on a body itself, when this might be allowed. For example, can one delay the kavura for the tzorach hameis, for the needs of the dead person, in order to allow enhanced kavod if family and friends want to come and attend the levaya, if there's a need for significant debate, even embalming, which we know certainly isn't something we normally do, for an extended delay. This is discussed in the teshuvas of the poskim. Is a tzorach gadol, a significant need enough to conduct a delay, or even where it's tzorach hameis, where it's for the needs of the dead body themselves, the need of the dead person themselves. If there's a significant need for the person themselves, is this enough to delay the kavura, or indeed to conduct operations, autopsy on the body itself? in the print in source 3, I printed a teshuvah of the Noida Yehuda, in which he discusses Nivel Hameis discusses dissecting a dead body for the sake of the dead person themselves. He's talking about a case where, for various technical halachic reasons, it is only possible to try the murderer if we are able to conduct some sort of form of autopsy on the dead body. And perhaps in more modern scenarios, and there's even a Tshuvas Hagonim that discusses such a thing, if one needs to conduct research on the body in order to find the criminal, to conduct detective inquiries and detect who it is who has committed this crime. And there's a possibility that this would be allowed in halacha, because this is for the covered hameis. What could be a greater covered for the mace than if they have indeed been murdered, for the criminal to be able to be brought to justice. So there are exceptions to this issue of conducting an autopsy in situations where there's a great and significant need, or where there is covered hameis at work. Now, in principle, as far as nivel hameis is concerned, pikuach nefesh would override this. So after all, if we can take some part of an organ of the dead body, and one could do so in a manner in which we don't get into any of the halachic issues, and we can use it for pikuach nefesh, for saving a life of someone who's present in front of us, this would be enough to deal with this. There is a teshuvah of the Noida Yehuda, which again, as I said, I printed in source 3, in which he makes this very point. He is talking in the context of medical research and conducting autopsies to perhaps train medical students or to understand disease better. And here we get to a more difficult and complex matter, which is where you don't have the immediate and pressing pikuach nefesh need, lefanecha, in front of one. So research conducted will never help any particular person present here. It's just greater understanding. It's perhaps training students to understand medicine better, or perhaps it's research in the long run in order to allow scientific insight to be achieved. And here the stance of the pikuach nefesh, which is one that's become adopted in different formulations by really all the poskim down to the modern age, from the Chazon Ish to Moshe Feinstein to many others, is that if there's an immediate and pressing need, perhaps in the midst of a plague or a medical crisis, where there is a chola lefanecha, there's an immediate recipient who could benefit from the nivel hameis, from the disregard for the kavod and honor of the corpse, one would indeed be allowed to do so, because pikuach nefesh would trump that. However, if it's just for some more ephemeral long-term goal, pikuach nefesh wouldn't trump that, because it isn't an immediate need in which there's a chola lefanecha. And certainly in principle, a recipient of organ donation, an ill person, a chola lefanecha, in front of one, doesn't mean they literally need to be geographically present. It means we know that there is definitely a recipient there. And when it comes to organ donation, the recipients are out there. We know that there's a waiting list, and therefore whether the recipient is here or the recipient is at the other end of the country, there is a chola lefanecha, there is a ill person in front of one, a chola lefanecha, a pikuach nefesh in front of one, and therefore this would be enough to allow one to conduct the procedure. So this would be one level of halachic issue, and the psak of the Noida Yehuda, his formulation has become one that's accepted down to modern poskim. I also printed here a source from the Binyan Sion. Binyan Sion was Rabbi Yaakov Ettlinger from Altona in the 1800s, and he deals with these halachic issues, and he raises a separate concern. Beyond the issa of nivel hameis, there are two other isurim floating around over here, possible isurim over here. There's an issa hana, a prohibition against benefiting from a dead person. I printed in source 2 a line in the Shulchan Aruch, in which the Shulchan Aruch makes it clear that the prohibition applies not just to dead person, but even to their shrouds, even to anything which is used in the burial, directly in the burial process. There's an issa hana, a prohibition against benefiting from a dead person, which presumably pikuach nefesh would help for. But the Binyan Sion, Rabbi Yaakov Ettlinger, who was dealing with a similar issue, raises the concern around using property that isn't one's own. And we come here to a very counterintuitive view, Shittas Rashi, a discussion in the Gemara about whether one can steal in order to save life. Now, ostensibly, we might think that in the same way as all other prohibitions are pushed aside in order to allow the saving of life, surely theft should similarly be treated, and I should be allowed to help myself to the property of someone else in order to save life. And indeed, the view of many poskim is that this is the case. One would be allowed to help oneself to someone's property in order to save life. Pikuach nefesh trumps theft like it trumps all other isurim, almost all other isurim in the Torah. Rashi is of the view that this is not so simple. Saving life, the mitzvah of Pikuach Nefesh, means using all the resources available to me to save life. However, to use resources which are not available to me, to helping myself to someone else's property, this wouldn't be included in the parameters of Pikuach Nefesh. And it's possible that this view makes its way into Shulchan Aruch to some degree or other. The Shulchan Aruch may pass like the view of Tosfos, who modifies this and says one can only help oneself to someone else's property to save their life if one is planning to pay back. And therefore, the Binyan Sion raises the issue here of consent. In helping myself to the corpse, the body of someone, in order to, in our context perhaps, to use their organs to save a life, are there issues around of this simply not being a resource that is available as per the view of Rashi? I'm helping myself, I'm using property to which I have no right to save a life. Saving life is no doubt the primary value and important thing, but can I help myself to other people's property? This just gets us down to the issue of can we assume deemed consent? The way the law has been phrased at the moment in the UK of this opt-out is a little bit of a confusion over here. Is the logic behind this new opt-out clause that there's deemed consent? In other words, we're assuming everyone is okay with this unless they tell us otherwise, and therefore we're really relying on consent? Or is there something else going on over here? Because is it true that there's deemed consent? Is this indeed correct? Or is there something else going on over here in which somehow the state is taking for itself the right to use bodies in order to save lives, even without consent? And there's those who have been following, those who are interested in law and legal philosophy, there's been quite a lot of controversy around this issue. Because it doesn't mean we're living in a country in which it assumes that unilaterally the state has the right to help itself to something for some form of greater good and greater cause. Now again, there's no denial that this is an absolutely vital cause. I mean, what could be better than saving life? But exactly what is going on in this legislation in a liberal democracy in which there's a sort of assumption that the state can take the body of another human being for a particular purpose is difficult legally and morally, raises lots of questions. And this is a topic which the Binyan Sion leads us to think about. Rabbi Yaakov Eklinka, is there consent over here? What consent can we assume? And this could be something that changes through the generations. The Binyan Sion assumes that medical research is something where one wouldn't know about. Perhaps that's something that's shifted a little bit in more recent times. Perhaps indeed there could be some form of deemed consent. There's a deeper issue over here, which is that a property right over a body at all. I mean, is a body an object which can be owned by anyone? Is it owned by anyone at all? Is it owned by the inheritors? Certainly neither in halacha nor in English law is that considered to be the case. Is it owned by the person themselves? In English law and probably in halacha also, a mace is not deemed a person in law. A mace is not deemed a person who can have property rights at all. So actually, who owns this? Is theft even the right way to think about this? Is perhaps a challenge more profoundly philosophical to the whole Binyan Sion's raising the issue of who exactly is consenting to this and who owns this property, and is this an example of helping oneself to property in order to save life? So there's a lot of complexities around this issue. It was a court case I saw a while back in which a museum had an exhibit which was embalmed, it was an embalming fluid of, I think, a heart or something like that, which was the original heart or lungs used in certain very famous scientific experiments. And this was an exhibit that had value to it because it was associated with, I think it was embalmed from the 1800s or something like that. It was associated with interesting scientific experiments. And the museum suffered a break-in and this item was stolen. And one of the claims put forward by the defense for the theft of this exhibit is that the museum has no ownership right over the heart itself. The heart isn't the sort of thing that can be owned, and therefore it doesn't belong to the museum more than it belongs to the thieves. This isn't the sort of thing which has ownership right at all. The lawyer for the museum in the end got them because even if this applies to the heart, it doesn't apply to the container and the embalming fluid. So there's an interesting, more contemporary example of where this was used in secular law. But again, it's an interesting discussion. The Binyan Sion flagging the concern of consent and deemed consent and property rights over here, which is certainly something we should reflect upon in this opt-in, opt-out discussion about what exactly this means about the legal framework within the country. In terms of the Issa Hana, the prohibition to benefit from a dead person, again, there's interesting halachic aspects around this. Beyond using Pikuach Nefesh as a bulldozer to push away this concern, Poskim raised the question of C. Pesach Frank and others raised the question of at least once the organ is transplanted, this now becomes part of the living body of the recipient. in which case one is no longer benefiting from a dead person, but from a live person. In other words, exactly how do we view this organ once it's introduced to the recipient of this, this organ? Maybe at that point it becomes a part of the new person. Presumably it does become part of the body, the living body of the new person, in which case the whole mechanism of Issa Hana makes sense in this context. Does it make sense to say one's forbidden to benefit from what is no longer part of a deceased person, but is now part of a new and living person? So these are some of the halachic discussions around perhaps the associated concerns over here. Chiyuv Kavura, Nivel Hameis, Issa Hana from the mace, the Kovet Hameis, the respect that we owe to a dead body. But I think it is fair to summarize the halachic discussion around this to say that where there is a significant need, namely Pikuach Nefesh, by and large, the consensus of most poskim, and certainly this would be, I think, halacha psuka, would be that these are not the issues that should concern us over here, as much as we consider kovet hameis, the respect to a dead body, kavura, the obligation to bury, nivel hameis, the need to avoid disrespecting a dead body, the importance of pikuach nefesh, of saving life, which organ donation offers, in general, would bypass, would trump these concerns. So those are, this is a summary perhaps of the halachic literature around these topics. But now we get really to the crux of the matter, which is leaving aside these other halachic issues, how exactly is organ donation carried out, and how can we be certain that the person whose organs are being taken is indeed halachically no longer considered alive, and therefore it's okay to take the organs? And the background to this problem is twofold. The first is to point out that these are new shilas. These are still relatively new shilas. 50, 60, 70 years ago, a person's heart stopped beating, cardiac arrest. There's pretty much nothing that could be done. CPR wasn't really an option. Very swiftly, there'd be no oxygen to the body, and with minutes, irreversible damage to the brain, and there was pretty much nothing to do. And the other way around was also true. If there was significant brain damage, a severe head injury, for example, would lead to one being unable to breathe. Again, lack of oxygen, heart stopping to work, and again, irreversible damage, and the process would go very quickly. This has shifted over the last years due to lots of things, including the ability of medication to keep blood pressure up, to keep the systems going, CPR, and particularly important in our conversation, mechanical ventilation, which means to say someone can have a heart attack and one can manually pump and get oxygen going around the body, including to the brain. And if one can get someone to the hospital and can ventilate it in time, continue to supply oxygen which could be absorbed by the lungs, and if the heart carries on working, it can pump to the rest of the body. And therefore we end up in this unusual situation in which a person can continue in some form of life for a long time. Now, why is there still discussion around this topic amongst the poskim? I mean, why hasn't this been dealt with by the great Moshe Feinstein in the 70s and 80s, and Shlomo Zalman and others who have addressed this? And the answer is that this is a weighty topic. It's not an issue that can be resolved swiftly. And in many respects, the legal and moral and ethical and halachic implications of all of this is still being worked out. So beyond the fact that procedures and processes are changing over time, and therefore you have a shifting landscape in terms of the technology, it's also something that is difficult. It's difficult to process, and I think in many ways, many of the conversations are still ongoing. This isn't an issue that's yet been fully worked out in morally and legally, nor has it been worked out completely halachically. In addition, and I mentioned this already in the introduction, the definition, amazingly, the definition of what's called life and death can vary in where one lives. So there'll be a difference between Israel, the UK, America, and even in America to some degree between the different states in America. There's a document I saw from the UK around this, and it said, I thought this was very broad actually, and certainly a proof that we no longer suffer from xenophobia in this country. It said an Italian and an Englishman, there's no difference between the two when it comes to biology, and therefore why should it be that we have different definitions of life and death in these two different countries? In other words, there's a real problem over here. How can it make a difference that if you happen to be in one domain, in one legal area, there's one definition of death, and in another area, another? So this is part of the difficulty around this. But the core point we need to understand halachically is why should there be a halachic opinion about this at all? I mean, after all, in other areas, halacha teaches us to trust the scientists, to trust the doctors, Comes to Paskin Yom Kippur Shilas, one will speak to the doctor who's in charge of the case, and will understand what they're saying, and then translate that into halachic terminology in order to work out what the best procedure over Yom Kippur is. Why is this a halachic question at all? And the point that needs to be understood over here is that there's certain things that the scientists, the doctors can tell us, and other things which they can't, so which is no relevance. When the body shuts down and the process of death is occurring, there's many elements to the shutting down process, many systems which shut down one by one. Imagine a large mansion, a palace with 300 rooms, and one by one, the lights are turned off in the rooms. And this is really what happens in the very tragic process of the end of life, in which one by one, different systems within the body are being turned off. And the halachic question, or the moral question, this is really a legal question, or a spiritual question, or a halachic question, existential question, is which rooms are particularly important in determining the halachic status, at which point death is considered to have occurred. And this isn't a scientific question. A scientist can tell us when each light goes off, when each part of the system shuts down. But they can't tell us which ones are the significant ones, the important ones to declare this person alive or dead. That being alive or dead is a concept. It's maybe a philosophical concept, a moral concept, a spiritual concept. It's not a scientific concept. You can take each system as it shuts down, but to explain, to determine which ones are the important components of this. Is it particular rooms that matter? Is it the heart? Is it the respiration? Is it the brain? Is it something different to any of these three, some other part of the system? Several hours after death, there may still be cells who are active. Days after death, perhaps hair and nails might still be growing. So exactly which one determines the moment of death and is significant, this is not a scientific question, but really which one matters, but is a halachic question that needs to be considered. In fact, in source 4 on page 4 in the handouts, right near the on the last page, about a third of the way down, this is actually mentioned in one of the NHS documents, which are in the Code of Practice, the diagnosis and confirmation of death, which is one of the most important documents one can have a look at if one wants to understand this issue. They acknowledge this, and they say, in short, whilst there are some ways in which parts of the body may continue to show signs of biological activity after the diagnosis of irreversible cessation of brainstem function, these have no moral relevance to the declaration of death. Now, this is a statement of morality. This is not a statement of science. This is a statement that, morally speaking, they have no relevance in the opinion of the authors of this document. They have no moral relevance. Now, these are experts in science, but not necessarily experts in morality, and certainly not experts on halacha. So what determines the moment of death can come down to a spiritual, halachic, or legal, or philosophical, or moral decision, rather than just being a scientific decision. I'll mention, since I referenced this document, that this extract I've taken is from the Code of Practice for the Diagnosis and Confirmation of Death. In the UK, at least, we pretty much don't have a law which determines the moment or the definition of death. There's a code of practice which determines it. In America, they introduced the universal a law to determine death. In Israel, they have that. Here in the UK, it's a code of practice, and this is an extract from this very important document, which is really the primary vehicle through which the courts recognise as having legal significance, but has not been passed by law. So this is why this is a halachic discussion at all. How do we define death? It's not a scientific issue, though science needs to inform it. It is a halachic issue. And pretty much there are three major life support systems in the body which make good candidates for being the determinant of death. And this is the brain, the respiratory or breathing system within the body, and the cardiac or circulatory system within the body, so the heart, which keeps the circulation going. And pre-modern times, the brain wasn't really spoken about. There wasn't really a method to determine whether the brain was functioning or not. So the determinant was primarily the respiratory or circulatory system. Now, the halachic discussion around which of these three is the primary determinant is very, very complicated, and certainly one which has been addressed from this very spot that I'm standing before. Previously, we've had great experts and myself standing talking about this, Professor Avraham Steinberg, amongst others, who have discussed this. And I really just want to run through a little bit of a summary of some of the primary sources before I try and unpick some of the things that I think are particularly relevant to us here in the UK. And just mention some of really the classic sources on the matter. There is a sugya in Yuma, which I printed on page 2, which is really an important source in terms of whether it's about respiration, the lungs breathing, or about cardiac activity, the heart pumping, and circulation, which is the primary determinant of death. as far as this source in Yoma is concerned. The source talks about Nofal Mapoles b'Shabbos, a building collapses on someone and someone is buried underneath the rubble, and it's Shabbos. And the question is, till what point can we continue trying to save this person's life by being Mechal Shabbos? So we're there with our shovels trying to remove rubble in order to rescue someone who we know is buried under this building. And we then come across the person themselves. And we need to determine, after partially evacuating them, whether this person is alive or not. So we could take their pulse, and perhaps if the pulse has stopped, then we'll know that sadly the person cannot be saved. Perhaps we could try and detect whether they're breathing or not, and if they're no longer breathing, they can no longer sadly be saved. And this is the discussion point of the sugya in Yoma. The sugya frames this discussion around if one finds their body and one is evacuating from the legs and up, or one is evacuating the body from the head and down. If one evacuates from head and down, one first confronts the chotem, the nose, and therefore one will detect breathing through the nose and through the mouth, respiration. If one is evacuating from the legs and up, one will come across the chest first, the heart, and therefore one will detect heart activity at this point. And that's how the Mishnah frames this discussion about whether the primary determinant of well, it's not clear that this is the context of the discussion in Yoma, but this is at least what we can draw out from this source of Yoma. What is the determining feature to know whether the person is alive or dead? Do we need to detect respiration, respiratory activity, or do we need to detect cardiac activity in order to determine if the person is alive or dead? Now, I'm only going to speak very briefly about this topic because I think this source, so oft quoted in all these discussions, is a little bit of a distraction, and a little bit losing what's really relevant over here. The fact is that whichever way exactly one learns this source, it's difficult to argue that a body in which respiration is no longer occurring would be considered halachically dead if there are other signs of significant signs of life. And this point has been made explicitly from Rashi and onwards in halachic literature. Rashi on the Mishnah comments that we are talking over here in a case in which someone is doimim ka'evan, I think I printed the source over here, where there's no other signs of life in this individual. Doimim amazes evarov, there's no movement whatsoever going on. So if one finds someone in which there's no movement of body whatsoever going on, and respiration has ceased, that's where there would be a discussion about this being a determinant of death. This is spelt out by the Chacham Tzvi, this is spelt out by the Chasam Sofer. All the halachic sources that look at this don't consider for a second really the possibility that cessation of respiration in and of in itself, if there are other vital signs, should be determined as what confirms death. Incidentally, and this really brings out the irony of using a source like this, of course, the halacha, no one would dream of paskening based on this source. Nowadays, if we find someone who is no longer breathing, what will we do? We'd attempt to resuscitate them. If that was the only sign. If we find someone who's buried under rubble and we detect that indeed there's no breathing taking place through the nose, through the mouth, would anyone dream of saying on Shabbos we cease our attempts to rescue this person? Certainly not. Of course, if there's no other damage elsewhere, of course we would attempt to resuscitate them. So anyway, we need to translate this Mishnah into modern terminology and understand we're talking about permanent cessation of independent breathing, rather than just the fact that they are no longer breathing now, because we are able to resuscitate in many situations. So the idea that this Mishnah can be a source that cessation of breathing in and of in itself should be a determinant of death, I think it's very, very hard to argue. And therefore, I'm really going to swiftly move on from all the sources that have been discussed around that. I did print the Chasam Sofer, who really sets 3 conditions. He says the person has to be mutal ka'evan domain. It has to be that all other bodily functions have ceased, and in those shum tefika, and there's no heartbeat, and bottom neshima, then breathing has ceased. Then the Torah would determine halachic death. The idea that one can have someone whose heart is beating, which is certainly a very important part of the bodily systems, and yet respiration has ceased, breathing has stopped, to say that that would be enough to determine death, I don't think carries significant halachic weight. What is more important, and perhaps more relevant to the discussion, is a Mishnah about hutaz harosh, removal of the head. And here I just want to explain why these 2 ideas need to be separated. It is true, and it is a fact, that when brain death has occurred, respiration, independent breathing ceases to be possible, whilst the heart, the circulatory system, can continue functioning for a time, certainly if it continues to be oxygenated, continue to be provided by oxygen. But fundamentally, if we dismiss respiration as a determinant of death, we need to look at brain activity in itself and to see whether the brain system is a determinant of death rather than just its effect on respiration. And here, it seems to me, the more important source is a Mishnah in Arlos, which are printed at the end of page 2. And the Mishnah is discussing, quite literally, Al Shaila. What's the determinants of the moment of death? Why is that an important halachic topic to know? Certainly at the time, the questions weren't around the possibility of saving this person's life. There weren't questions about the possibility of using organ donation. So for all sorts of halachas, for Tumah and Tara, where the ritual impurity occurs in this location, when the person is only from the point they're halachically dead, from levirate marriage, from Yibum, the Chiyuv of Yibum, to understand whether the person is alive or dead at the moment, whether a divorce can still be given on their behalf by an agent, Yerusha, inheritance fact, who died first, and whether the inheritance goes via route A or route B. There's all sorts of reasons why determining the exact moment of death might be halachically important. And it discusses the concept of death throes, the death process, if you like, in itself. But what the Mishnah says is clear is that if there's hatzozat harosh, if there's severance of the head, if the head is removed, then even though seemingly other bodily functions continue, they have no halachic significance. These are merely like the zonov shel hatar shemefachesas. This is like the tail of a lizard which twitches. This has no halachic significance. This is movement which continues post-mortem, but certainly this is post the death of a person because hatzozas harosh has occurred. And this is the point that has interested the poskim much more. And I think this is the point that we need to focus on just for a couple of minutes, because I'm not going to go fully into the medical reasons why this is the case, but from a layman's point of view, being able to remove organs as quickly as possible after the death of a person is an essential over here, in order to take organs which haven't been damaged too much, which have still been well oxygenated, and various other bodily functions have continued with these. And therefore, if we can use brain death as the determinant of death, this allows much more organ donation allows generally much organ donation to take place. I'll talk in a few minutes about which organs this is less of a concern with. Now, determining the moment of death, 2 criteria have really been put forward if one wishes to look at the brain. One is the cessation of the death of the brain itself, and the other is the death of the brain stem. The brain stem contains, is basically responsible for reflex actions like the gag reflex. So if something is inserted into the throat, one will gag. For spontaneous respiration, which is breathing, as we mentioned, without it being maintained by something else, through the pupils changing under different light input, pupils getting larger and smaller if they different light input is put into them, various changes of reflex actions. This is the brain stem. This is the stem that links the brain, primarily links the brain to the rest of the body. Now, 2 poskim in particular dealt with the issue of whether brain death can be considered brain death in the early era of discussion around these points. I'm talking here about the 70s and the 80s and the 90s in the first stage of the conversation. And these were Moshe Feinstein and Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. And there are many teshuvas of Ramosha around this topic. And there's a lot of debate about how to learn these teshuvas. They are very, very difficult pieces to work through. There's issues and questions about consistency between the pieces. Was Ramosha changing his mind or not? Ramosha himself references other pieces. It's not clear exactly what his understanding around these topics were and exactly what the scenarios that he was talking about. And I printed one sample of such a tshuva from Yoredei Chelik Gimel on page 3, in which he speaks about this. And for those who have times afterwards, one can have a little look at this and see how difficult some of these teshuvas are to understand and to see exactly what points he was trying to make. And a lot of the heat around the topic has been generated by different students of Ramosha and family members interpreting his words differently. And then Ramosha, certainly in America, is the most influential posek, exactly what his stance was on this matter. I think, though, one can, to a degree, cut through many of these issues, because it's important to understand that there's really 2 stages of extrapolating from Hutas Harosh to practical halacha about how this would apply to brain death. The first stage is, we're not talking here about severance of the head, that's clear. From the external point of view, we're not talking about the classic understanding of the head being chopped off, Hutas Harosh. The Gemara tells us very clearly what the halachic criteria are if we're talking about literally separation between head and body. As per much halachic literature, this is defined very clearly. Are we talking about roiv? Are we talking about the simonim, the simonim that are used for shechita, the air and food pipes in the neck and throat? Are we talking over here about most of the head being cut off, or all the head being cut off? These are when we're talking about the external structure. What we're talking here is about the link between the head and the body internally. So stage chiddush number one is, we're not talking about the external separation between head and body, we're talking about an internal separation. Now, when we're talking about the internal separation, are we talking about a separation of function, or even there, are we talking about a physiological separation? And here Moshe makes his view very clear, and he says we're talking here about nisakel, where there's a physical decay of a visible and physical decay of the brainstem. In other words, a separation has occurred internally in the nervous system itself, not just a functional cessation of the operation of the nervous system over there. So point number one is there's a number of degrees of extension. We can have where the head is detached from the body, to whatever degree of detachment we're talking about. And this is what the classic Mishnah and halachic sources would have known about till very recent times. A second stage is where there's an internal detachment. And Moshe is talking about an internal detachment where there's literally a breakdown of the cellular structure itself internally. And he says this absolutely explicitly. This is not the case that we're talking about when we're talking about brainstem death. Brainstem death, we're speaking about a third stage. And the third stage is where it ceases to function. We're not talking about a material, externally visible difference in the stem of the brain itself, where it somehow it's somehow become molded and broken down in its substance itself. We're talking about functionality. And the extension of the concept of functionality is a separate halachic discussion to that which Moshe was talking about. Now here Rav Shlomo Zalman steps in, and Rav Shlomo Zalman does talk about functionality. And he talks about the cessation of brain activity. The problem is exactly what do we mean by the cessation of brain activity? So the way the tests are done here in the UK are simply testing functionality of brainstem. They basically test for the reflexes that we've discussed. So a bright light will be shone into they call this the bedside test, the clinical test. A bright light will be shone into the eyes, and there'll be a question about the pupil reaction. There'll be a tube inserted into the throat, and the gag reflex will be tested for. Something will be brushed across, perhaps lightly brushed across the eyelid to check if there's a reaction there. The pupil itself to check if there's a reaction there. There'll be tests for some of these reflex actions, which are taken as determining the functionality of the brainstem. In America, different sorts of tests is used, and in Israel also now they've required this test to be used, in which they're looking for actual cellular activity, brain cell activity. So they'll inject a dye in order to see whether there is blood and therefore oxygen entering the cells. They will detect electrical activity to see if there's any electrical activity taking place in the brain. So here we're testing functionality. Now, what exactly, when we talk about Rav Shlomo Zalman's criteria, do we mean by cessation of brain activity? And this is clear that there's two limitations here in what we really mean when we talk about brain death over here. Not only are we talking about a threshold of activity, testing whether there's a threshold level of blood flow into the brain or a threshold level of electrical activity in the brain, we're not saying that there's no activity going on at all. More than that, there are different regions of the brain, some of which are still operating. There is indeed even communication taking place between the brain and the body, even after the brainstem itself stops working. When medically we're told that the brain ceases to communicate with the body, we mean through the nervous system, through the brainstem itself. However, for example, when it comes to sugar, maintaining correct sugar levels in the body, which ceases to work as we're aware in diabetes and other such things which is hormonally controlled, this continues to operate. Even after the death of the brainstem, if life is maintained externally, a woman can carry a pregnancy to term and a baby can be delivered. Now, I mention all of this not to take sides in a very, very complicated halachic debate, but simply for us to understand the terminology that's being used and the questions we need to ask ourselves. The question we need to ask ourselves is, are we talking here about brain death? Or are we talking about brainstem death? Is the Teshuvah of Rav Moshe, in which he talks about the brain stem being comparable to Hutas HaRosh, which is in his understanding, was talking about literally the separation of the brain from the body, as opposed to just a functional separation because it's no longer working. And when we use terminology like brain death, what exactly do we mean? Is the brain indeed really dead? Is this what the tests are doing and determining or not? And everything here I'm saying is not controversial in the least. In other words, no one in the field would claim that these tests are determining total death of the brain or total indeed cessation activity of the brain stem. These are simply determining a crossing of a threshold in terms of the activity and a crossing of a threshold in terms of the amount of brain activity. It's important therefore to be aware. Here in the UK, for example, we're talking about brain stem. In Israel, they're talking about cessation of all brain activity, already a difference between the areas. In America, they use the language of talking about the cessation of the brain itself, though the tests they conduct are just in the brain stem based on an assumption that the brain stem ceases to function, the brain itself will cease to function. Important, therefore, not to confuse the language used across different countries and different legal spheres. And then we get to a most significant point, and one that I don't think I've seen referenced at all in the halachic discussion, particularly around the situation here in the UK. And this is the chart that I printed on page 4. I just want to mention this chart very, very briefly. And this gets us to the issue of, if you look, for example, at the UK, about halfway down the chart, you will see that some 40% of donations in the UK take place through DCD, and some 60% take place through what they call DBD. Now, DBD is donation after brain death. DCD is donation after circulatory or cardiac death, which means to say that the whole discussion around organ donation is focused around brain death. 40% of donation in the UK takes place after cardiac death. But what exactly do we mean by cardiac death? If you mean what's known in the literature as uncontrolled cardiac death, that means to say someone is found who has had cardiac activity that has ceased, and we're talking about organ donation taking place there, then from a halachic point of view, this is probably the easiest scenario to look at. We're talking about someone whose cardiac activity has ceased by itself. The ability to carry out organ donation post-cardiac death, uncontrolled cardiac death, that means to say you find someone in a situation where cardiac activity has ceased by itself, is very difficult. Why is it difficult? Because it would involve coordination in which a person has already suffered cardiac failure, and now one is able to have all the equipment on site, the recipients on site, and one is able to conduct a organ transfer as quickly as possible within that time. The amount of uncontrolled donation after cardiac or circulatory death that takes place in the UK is zero. None of that takes place in the UK. The setup of structures of hospitals in which we don't have these mega hospitals, we have relatively small hospitals compared to some other countries, means that this is simply technically impossible. What does take place in the UK is donation after cardiac death, which they call controlled donation. What does that mean to say? That means to one takes someone who has not yet suffered brain death. That means to say the whole of the halachic discussion around brain death is irrelevant for 40% of organ donation here in the UK. One takes someone who hasn't yet suffered brain death, but is deemed to have an irreversible, deemed to be in a situation in which there's no possibility of restoring this person to good health. Treatment is withdrawn from this person. The person is taken off the ventilator, which is maintaining the breathing taking place, in order to, because it's deemed that medical treatment won't be effective, which therefore allows organ donation to take place. In the build-up to this process, the person is taken to the theatre and preparations are made in order to allow donation to occur. Preparations are made in which organs are assessed for whether they will be able to be transferred or not. Tubes are inserted in order to allow the treatment, the maintenance of the health of the organs post the withdrawal of the treatment. And here the halachic shayla that needs to be considered is completely different. This isn't at all now the halachic shayla of brain death. This is the question of two things. Withdrawing a ventilator from someone who is not brain dead, is still alive in terms of both the brain and the brain stem. Withdrawing a person off a ventilator. And secondly, the issue of conducting medical intervention and invasive procedures on someone who halachically is very near the end of death, what would be known as a goses, moving such a person to the theatre and conducting these invasive procedures. Now, again, my point in standing over here is not to give up a stuck about such a thing, but simply to mention that these are two completely different halachic issues, which are almost not discussed whatsoever in the literature and halachic literature. And the reason they're not discussed is because DCD in Israel, which doesn't appear in this table, in other words, donation after cardiac death, controlled cardiac death, is zero in Israel. In Israel, they simply won't allow this process to take place. So beyond all the discussion around brain death, which is what everyone focuses on in this discussion, we have a completely different child, a completely different question about taking a person who isn't brain deaf, whose breathing is being maintained by a ventilator, whose heart is still working independently, conducting tests and then procedures whilst the person is still on this in order to prepare for organ donation, then removing the life-sustaining medication that keeps the blood pressure up and removing ventilation, in order then to trigger cardiac arrest, trigger heart failure, and then allow donation after cardiac death to take place. Again, a very, very different discussion, and one that you won't find in any of the internationally produced and American or Israeli produced halachic discussion around this point. I printed on the final sheet the document that the consent clause that was prepared after a lot of work and effort and conversations, particularly between the London Mason, the Chief Rabbi's office, and the UK government, in order to allow not a complete opt-out, but an opt-in, opt-out in which one allows organ donation to take place at the, following the advice and support of rabbinic presence. Now, if one remains opted in without signing anything whatsoever, in the current regulatory environment, the family should still be consulted. But as far as the law is concerned, the legal requirement, there isn't a legal duty for the family to be consulted. So there is a degree of vulnerability to this. If one opts out, it means there's no chance of any organ donation occurring. The beauty of this document over here is that it allows the decision to be made under rabbinic guidance at the time. Now, what will be the situation? What will be the suck that will be given? The answer will be, it all depends on the details and the cases. I already referenced there's enough questions and shyness over here that each case will need to be looked at on a case-by-case basis. The statistics are very low. Out of the population in the UK of about 60-odd million, there's about 600,000 deaths a year, so about 1%. Of these, about 6,000 are potential donors, and about 1,600 are used. So we're looking at 0.01%. Of this, the number of shiders, therefore, that will come up in the Jewish community are perhaps a maximum of 10 a year. And the reason why these are very rare, because of the conditions that are necessary, from needing a patient to die in hospital, to the patient not being able to die suddenly, to the patient needing to be in cancer care and intubated and everything else that makes this a condition. But this certainly means that this is needs to be done through an individual case-specific shider. There are things that often can be donated. For example, cornea famously can be donated. There are tissues like skin, tendons, heart valves, arteries, which can be donated under certain circumstances, bones. Were the medical practice in the UK to change, for example, were uncontrolled DCD, in other words, donation after cardiac death to become a possibility, even when it wasn't triggered by withdrawal of ventilator and treatment, but to occur by itself, were that to go up, then there would be far less halachic problems with this, and this would certainly allow pancreas can be donated very well after uncontrolled DCD, the kidneys can be donated, liver and lungs to a degree, to a slightly lesser degree. But the reality is that this is therefore something that's moving and changing and needs to be looked at on a case-by-case basis. I would therefore encourage everyone to sign up to this document, which allows this to be dealt with on a case-by-case basis. And for us just to reflect for a few moments about where this leads us. This leads us in a situation where there's no denying that there will be cases where, when we look at it specifically, there are organs that we can't donate, even though the wider and general population would be able to donate. And there are organs that, dealt with correctly under, depending on the legal framework and the medical framework, donation might be a possibility. What can we do about this? How can we live with being a community where we are using slightly different criteria to the rest of the population? I think there are other areas in which we can improve ourselves. I think there's donation that can be given from life. If we could double the national average in terms of donation of blood, in terms of donation of kidneys, and by the way, one should be aware that the most significant shortfall of organs in the UK is kidney. Donating stem cells, which is possible to do from life. Donating of bone marrow, or the liver lobe, many people don't realize this is also possible to give when one's alive. If we could shine as a community in this area, certainly it would mean that we do not find ourselves in the uncomfortable situation of being takers, not givers. If we sign up to this document, it means that when it is halachically possible, organs can be donated, and that's also an important step. But I just want to conclude by saying that organ donation, as I said, is rare, very, very rare. In addition, it's tzedakah and chesed done post-mortem. We can do plenty of tzedakah and chesed whilst we are still alive. We can save lives whilst we are still alive. And therefore, certainly, in a way, this brings me back to the opening part of this, we need to excel in other forms of chesed and tzedakah also. I want to use this platform, finally, just to really deliver a message on behalf of the North West London doctors. Many of them are seeing very significant rises of corona in our own community, and I've asked everyone really to take seriously the government rules and regulations that are in place at the moment. If we're talking about saving lives, we need to be careful to continue to follow the guidelines. There's a weariness around this whole topic. We feel we went through it, been there, done that, now let's be able to move on. Unfortunately, we are not yet in a situation where we're able to move on, and therefore, again, this is an area where we have the possibility of taking advantage of Pekuach Nefesh, of saving lives at this very moment. So I hope that's given a little bit of a summary of some of the halachic topics, and I wish everyone that we should mavir and asra gezerah, tzedakah tatzum noves, these should be shadows that are unnecessary, and all of us are able to be healthy, and when well, I wish you well.
Thank you.
Hello, Daniel.
Thank you so much.